we are living in the era of national populism.
Mm-hmm.
And this man, Narendra Modi, like Erdogan, like Netanyahu, like Orban, have to organize elections to tell the people, I am the people.
Yeah.
They need this popular mandate. So they have to take the risk of losing elections.
Although this was a well-fought election battle, the opposition spoke about jobs, they spoke about prices, they spoke about China, they spoke about Adhan, but they didn't speak about the Biden's systems. Everybody's kept silent about it.
It is a minority, perhaps, of the whole of Indian society, but it is a very substantial minority.
And active.
The ideology of Hindutva is very deeply rooted in society, and that makes me less convinced than I want to be, if you will, at the idea of, a cycle having come to an end.
Except that the antidote in terms of narrative to Hindutva is caste.
We find that when you have weak coalition governments, you actually get a strong and activist court. So what happened to the court under Mrs. Indira Gandhi? Very similar to what has happened today.
Yeah.
And then when did judicial activism come about? When there were coalition governments in power. So I think the people of India and the politics of India has to change. Then it will be relatively easy to bring back these institutions.
Salam, Namaste Zindabad. I welcome you all to a new episode of the series of conversations we are organizing around the state of the Indian Republic. I'm privileged here. We are sitting actually in Heidelberg in the South Asia Institute, and we are two of the finest minds and hearts concerned with Indian democracy with us. And here, it can start with Rahul Mukherji, who was recently director of the South Asia Institute. He's a professor, head of Department of Political Science. We have Christophe Jaffrelot, who is widely acknowledged as being one of the most informed analysts and observers of democracy and its feelings in recent years. He's a professor at the King's College in London and in the Sciences Pole, which is the people's science of balance. And here's John Harris. John Harris is one of the most senior scholars on India, I think, many decades. He's a professor emeritus international in the National School of Simon Pearson University. He worked earlier as faculty at LSE, SOAS, and has had also a very illustrious career. So wonderful to have you all with us, and let's start right away. My first question is that we're recording at a time when 10 years of the prime ministership of Mr. Modi has reached a new landmark. But my first question is, to what extent did the 10 years of Modi in his first two terms, what did it do to Indian democracy? Am I right in my understanding that Indian democracy was badly battered in multiple ways in these 10 years? And if so, what was the kind of damage that happened to Indian democracy? So Ram, why don't we start with them?
Yes, I think it was badly battered and sort of sought to be completely decimated in the last 10 years, apart from some of the resilience that we have seen in recent times, which has come as much from civil society and to a certain extent from political parties. And that battery has a clear ideological position that did not exist in the Indian past. In the past, we have had authoritarian propensities driven by political opportunism. But in the current phase, we find a convergence of political opportunism and crass ethno-nationalism. The ideological project and the political project have converged. And
Rahul, if I can interrupt you, just for general audience, what do you mean by ethno-nationalism?
Ethno-nationalism can be of a variety of types. It can be based on race, it can be based on religion, it can be based on other markers as well. In the Indian case, obviously the convenient marker is the majority Hindu divide. So whereas despite its many failings, what we call Hinduism today has an enormous capacity to be plural. It has many, many negatives, such as oppression and discrimination, but it has an amazing capacity to be plural. It is very diverse. This is sought to be reduced to a category, which looks to me like a rather new category based on a certain kind of an experiment where you homogenize a whole lot of people who are called Hindus into an identity which is made to feel as if it is threatened by the minority community. And the feeling of this threat is then mobilized in politics. So when I say ideological, that is the mark. When I say convenient, it is assumed that it has, to a very great extent, been able to mobilize people in its direction, almost unbelievably. And the manner in which it has decimated in institutions is the following. We have done some research on this. One pathway of that is just to interpret old laws in a different way, to attack opposition politicians and civil society organizations. The second is where political opposition is very powerful, change the law incrementally. And the third is where political opposition is weak, completely displace earlier laws. And in this manner, you want to decimate the political opposition by intimidating both the civil society that wants to uphold the constitution and which is the bulwark for politics, which actually seeks to protect the constitution. And it is for these reasons that I believe that this is a very unusual moment in the history of India.
Thanks. Christophe, you've written extensively, but your book on India under Modi is, I think, will remain in history one of the most significant and important resources to reflect on what happened in these 10 years. Just looking at the lens of the practice of democracy, which is electoral, but democracy, of course, means a lot more. What got damaged during these 10 years?
Well, many things indeed, and I would like simply to elaborate on what Rahul has just said. For me, the impact is twofold. One, you make what was a multicultural society majoritarian. And therefore, the first casualties are the minorities, transforming minorities into second-class citizens. And you do it de facto by letting vigilante groups exerting cultural policing at the grassroots level very violently, and not only symbolically violently, but of course physically violently. And we have this series of lynchings, we have this series of riots. And the state is protecting these groups. The police is protecting these groups. You can't distinguish.
Encouraging them, I think, even more.
Exactly. You can say that the police has subcontracted some of the job they were supposed to do. So cultural policing is definitely one dimension of this transformation of minorities into second-class citizens. But from this de facto majoritarianism, we see a de jure majoritarianism taking shape as well, with new laws. The most famous one, of course, is the Citizenship Amendment Act. But if you look at the state level, you have the laws making interreligious marriages almost impossible, conversion almost impossible. So we have, this is, for me, the first thing to say, the transformation of democracy.
I agree a lot. I talked recently about the clouds of Nuremberg, gathering over India. So, you haven't straightforwardly said Muslims don't have citizenship rights. You haven't straightforwardly said interreligious marriages are unlawful. But you use the law in such a way that effectively this is what is being described.
And my fear is, my deep fear is that we have therefore in the making what I call a deeper state, a state that is not only made of officials who could be replaced if there is a change of guard at the center, but a state that is related now to very deeply embedded activists who control the streets, who control what's going on in society. And when we saw the Congress coming back in Rajasthan, coming back in Karnataka, but not in a position to return to square one, so far as the minorities were concerned, that's definitely something that goes beyond the political. It becomes a kind of societal issue. And ghettoization is another symptom of that. Mixed neighborhoods becoming much more complicated. And again, de facto and de jure. In Gujarat, you have a law making it impossible to sell your house to someone who is not from your community without the permission of the district collector. Right. So that's the first major damage. And the other one, of course, is, as Rahul said, the institutions being breaking down, erased, broken indeed. The Supreme Court, the Election Commission, two pillars of the rule of law are just examples of this. We could find many others.
Yeah.
But here, I'm wondering, have they succumbed to pressure or have they anticipated pressure?
Or are they ideologically driven? You see, that is even more problematic. So it is a journalist promoting the ideology of hate for their career, or are they fearful of losing their jobs, or do they actually believe it? My fear is that the increasing segments of the judiciary, the media, and the civil service to which I'm belonged, which are ideologically driven. And that's going to be much harder to deal with.
Yeah. In that case, we are somewhat back to the emergency period. You mentioned journalists. You remember this very, very famous sentence? They were asked to bend and they crawled.
Absolutely.
So, this is really a key question again. Is it something that they believe in? Or is it something that they are prepared to change if power also changes? And we will only know after seeing power changes if one day it changes.
So, and we've come to what we can look for in the future. But 10 years and this kind of transformation, at one level, it's stunning. But you do need to remember that Nazi Germany, between Hitler's election, incidentally with 33% vote share, which was exactly with the vote share with which Mr. Mukherji came to power in 2014. And he would not have come to power if the center and the left had combined. And so, with all of the ironies of history, between that and his defeat in suicide was 12 years. So, and a society...
But there's a big difference, Harsh. After Hitler took over power, there was no election.
Yeah, absolutely.
We are in a different pattern. We are living in the era of national populism. Mm-hmm. And this man, and Modi, like Erdogan, like Netanyahu, like Orban, have to organize elections to tell the people, I am the people.
Yeah.
They need this popular mandate. So they have to take the risk of losing elections. And in fact, Erdogan lost local elections recently. Netanyahu lost also and could could come back. But it's a different game. The problem being that it's not a level playing field, the electoral competition. And that's why there are elections.
It's far from not level.
It's far from that level because of the media coverage, because of the money that is spent,
and the misuse of restated.
But in spite of that, we saw Narendra Modi losing his majority. So that's why I would not put this regime in the same category as what we would call dictatorship, fascism. Between Putin's Russia and Modi's India, there is still this big difference. Now, how far can that take us?
How far will that endure?
Exactly. And secondly, how far can that take us so far from the original model that we will never come back to square one? These are the other questions.
Can I just a sentence, because I just want to put a word to what Christophe was saying, and I've called it competitive authoritarian.
Yeah.
This is a situation in comparative politics research which shows that, and that's why I think Christophe is right, that more regimes can actually become more democratic from a competitive authoritarian situation, because you can't completely kill the democratic propensity. However, the challenges are as grave as we all agree.
And John, as probably the oldest scholarly observer of India about Warifat, how do you see those 10 years taking a longer kind of time span? Looking at India as a republic, what happened in these 10 years? How much of India's great democratic potential, Winston Churchill famously and many others were so skeptical about the capacity of this country to actually practice as a society democracy, and so much of it was proved wrong. What happened in the last 2 years?
Yeah, one thought that I've had while my friends here have been talking, and in answer to your questions, Harsh, has been to reflect that while there is no doubt whatsoever in my mind that Indian democracy has had a tremendous battering over the last 10 years, we mustn't forget that there is sadly a longer history of the decline of the democratic hopes and aspirations of the Republic. One point which sticks in my mind from the work I've done recently, which has had me rereading the Constituent Assembly debates, for example, is the important occasions on which it was said, usually by Ambedkar, sometimes by others, that how much would depended on the character of the leadership, of the character and so much trust in the character and the integrity of the leaders. With the passage of Article 22, that remarkable article of the Constitution of India, which we might sort of say, gives Indian citizens the right to be detained without trial, without bail by the state. That was one of the occasions when members of the Constituent Assembly said, "Of course, we trust the leaders not to abuse the powers that they have." And of course, over time, sadly, leaders have made full use of the powers that they have under the Constitution. Leaders before Modi, and we have to remember, legislation like the draconian, unlawful UAPA. The Modi government has made that legislation even more draconian than it was before. But heavens, it was already there.
And it was misused, maybe to a one or three, but
it was misused
against dissent.
So, what worries me in the present situation is that a lot of the laws which have actually made it possible for this regime to operate in the way it has, it's been a kind of legalized lawlessness, if you will. The use of laws to perpetrate a certain kind of lawlessness. And I worry that, if you will, that the laws are still there.
But I still wanted to underline something that Rahul said, is that what makes this regime different from the past is that it's ideologically driven.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that you have to bear in mind. Which brings me to my central question in this discussion. Mr. Modi is back, but this time he is heading an alliance. And it's an interesting alliance because it's not an ideological alliance. It's not, I mean, his remaining in power is dependent on two political parties, three political parties, which are not ideologically aligned to the RSS agenda from the nationalism. That's the check and balance possible. Now, the three of you may be some of the finest scholars, social scientists, political scientists that we have, but you're not astronomers. I wish you were, but even so, just based on your scholarship and your observation of the way Indian politics and Indian society function, I want, what's keeping me awake, every night for weeks since we went to results is three sets of questions, and let me place them one by one. The first of them, and to my mind, if I have to make a hierarchy of where Indian democracy has most floundered, is the hate. Is the hate that has become central to our political life. And I think Nazi Germany, to me, is continuous. The mind in democracy is not just about the will of the majority, because that can devolve into fascism. It is about the defense of every minority. And that's where I think we've seen the most severe backlash. I think many people, when I talk about what's happening to India's Muslims, think it's about what is happening to a community. It's actually what's happening to the foundational idea of this country itself. And therefore, it's powerful. It is about Copenhagen people and their future, but it's also about the future of all of India. So is that going to change? I mean, that's my first question. Do you think that in the more humbling circumstances in which Mr. Modi has regained power, is it going to in any way restrain this government from steps that it would clearly have taken, a national NRC, for instance, backed by a CA, which means that it will be a national NRC, which will basically be targeted at one community, the others will be protected. Using reopening questions of the mosques in Kashi and Mathura, a uniform civil code which is clearly against Muslim personal law, and so on. And a continuance of this kind of hate violence. At the time that we speak today, you see that alarming rise, and I work very closely on hate violence. I'm seeing an alarming rise in hate violence, which is really worrying for me. And the two alliance partners don't seem to be having too much of a problem with it. None of the political opposition is really speaking out against it. So what is the future for India's Muslim minorities? What is the future for the defense of the foundation idea of India itself? Is my big question. And if you have time, then a couple.
Yeah, my view on this is that, and it's something I have expressed in the Journal of Democracy earlier this year, is that the story of the political opposition that has to stand up is both half empty and half full. I would say half empty because comparative politics teaches us that under conditions of extreme repression, opposition parties come together. And that has happened in the case of Iran. So we see a Samajwadi party shaking hands with the Congress party in a way that was unbelievable. Then we also see coalition partners like Mamata Banerjee, who would not even contest elections together, saying that we will stand together. Now, I call this half empty and half full. Half empty because it could have happened earlier, and it could have happened in a more coherent way. And if it had happened in a more coherent way, with much better effort from the leader of the Indian National Developmental and Inclusive Alliance, the Indian National Congress, despite the fact that these elections were compromised, I think there would have been more seats.
Yeah.
So this is why I call it half empty. On the other hand, I also call it half full because it was not an easy enterprise, and the last elections did not see. And so better late than never, and we've seen it.
Yeah.
So in my view, the answer to your question will hinge, and because I'm not an astrologer, I won't give you an answer, will hinge to a very great extent on how creatively the political opposition can make use of repression to come together against another bulwark ideology. And it should not be so difficult for them, because this is a government that has incarcerated chief ministers under reprehensible legal circumstances. So the writing is on the wall. What's your alternative, right?
Yeah.
So you don't have to be a Nelson Mandela or Mohandas Gandhi to do this. You have to be a far more pragmatic politician to understand that the odds are completely against you. The entire society will turn against you. Your ideology will be dead. So I think if the political opposition, under conditions of heightened repression, where I would say that the ruling dispensation has and is still have been there. So, all these things that you're talking about, more lynchings, Mrs. Arundhati Roy being, and, I'm sure activists like you are also being hit even more ferociously than in the past. But all of this message has to go to the political opposition, because the political opposition also depends on civil society. And if the political opposition, for the sake of preserving its social capital and its substance from where it can actually regenerate itself, and for its own political survival, remains intact, then I think this kind of an aggression that we are beginning to see, where the coalition leader of a party which doesn't have a simple majority is pretending as if nothing has happened, this can fall apart. And there are enough senior politicians who can make it through that. On the other hand, if it happens that the management of the current ruling coalition is done in such a clever and shrewd way that all those legal strictures, which are completely beyond the purview of what we understand as the rule of law, are used in a manner to intimidate people who have joined the ruling coalition, and at the same time to break the current coalition, which is not in either its short-term or long-term interests.
The opposition could.
Then, of course, we will be moving from a competitive authoritarian to an authoritarian situation. And therefore, I can't give you an answer, but I can basically say that these are the odds. Every leader who is either Hindu nationalist or pretending to be Hindu nationalist or sucking up to Hindu nationalism has to decide whether that's the future of that leader. And every leader in the political opposition who is claiming to fight Hindu nationalism has to understand how grave this struggle is. And my view is that what the election results have shown today make it possible for resistance to happen It has opened up a window, a small ray of light. But that window can easily be shut if they do not act at this point in time.
Now that there is really a very clear-eyed kind of so looking into the window into the future. I just felt saddened that you didn't even talk about the possibility of the ideological and moral commitment of the political opposition to fight what is happening to India's Muslims. That is, I think, to me, the biggest crisis. And I've noticed that although this was a well-fought election battle, the political opposition spoke about jobs, they spoke about prices, they spoke about China, they spoke about Adhan, but they didn't speak about the violence against Muslims. Everybody kept silent about it.
Yeah.
And I think that it is that complicity that really worries me. And
I mean, surely, and Harsh, here it's important, I think, to think of the data from the CSTS Loginity post-poll survey, which, okay, some of the findings were, from our point of view, quite positive, but less support actually fought for minorities than in 2019.
it was not. I mean, we wanted to celebrate, and we said, we will celebrate. But although my politics is based on some naive optimism, I had to admit that this wasn't a vote against hate. It was a vote for better governance, jobs, etc., but not a negation of the politics of hate. And Christophe, I feel perhaps closest to your scholarship on these issues, and therefore my question: do you see the election outcome of 2024 leading to a life of greater security, dignity, belonging, citizenship, India's understand?
No, I will repeat more or less to begin with the metaphor of Rahul, the glass as full, the glass as empty. But I would put the emptiness at a lower level. I think the glass for me is more full than empty. It's not half.
That's both.
And for two reasons.
The glass for you is more full.
Yes, than empty. And I think for two reasons. Well, let's begin with the emptiness, and it is indeed a reflection of what you've just said. Secularism is not what it used to be in society today.
Yeah.
The defense of secularism is not what it is, and that I feel is even more.
Yes. Yes. And the risk of Narendra Modi insisting on polarizing society is still very much there. Look at this election campaign.
Yeah. It was horrible.
Never before. You have to go back to 2002, to the Gaurav Yatra.
Yeah. It's like that.
To see this repeat of Amban Shamare Pachis, You had to go back to 22 years before for seeing this kind of communal overtone. So this is the card he will definitely continue to play. And he has to be careful because there are people on his right who will play it if he doesn't. So that's why the glass is partly empty. It is more full than empty for two reasons to my mind. We are at the end of a cycle. And for 40 years, Indian politics has cycles with alternation of two dominant repertoires, Hindutva and caste politics. And Hindutva is a response to caste politics. Hindutva is a response to Mandal. How do you make sure that these low caste people would not take over by telling them, don't look at the Brahmin or the Patel or whatever as your enemy, look at the Muslim as your enemy. And it worked. There is no doubt that there is an OBC vote for, even a Dalit vote for BJP. Now this is a little bit over. And what we see is caste politics staging a comeback. The caste census is very similar to the Mandal question.
Really?
One issue for the first time after so many years, one issue around which everybody can rally. Now, when you have to distribute quotas, you're stuck. To whom will you give them? when you just have to ask for one single question, that is, do you want a caste census? Then you have 75% of the society that will rally on. And it will be very interesting to see how Mr. Nitish Kumar does not support a caste census. So that's why I think we are at the end of a cycle, and the opposition will certainly continue to push in this direction. The other reason is federalism. What is the real institution? The only institution that has resisted authoritarianism? Federalism. Now, when you attack chief ministers the way they have attacked chief ministers, when you make the life of the chief ministers in the South especially so complicated, there'll be the delimitation issue coming up. The South is almost on a separatist path in many ways.
Pushing them into that.
They are pushing them in this direction. So, if you have 2 chief ministers or 3 chief ministers that are really needed by the ruling coalition, they'll give and take, but they'll take more than they'll give, and you'll be back to a logic we knew. And this is why I just end on this. I agree with John. We have to look at things in perspective. No, Hindutva did not fall. Narendra Modidva did not fall from the sky. It's the legacy of history. It's a legacy of definitely Mandal. Yeah. It's a legacy of years of liberal policies. Remember Manmohan Singh being the most decentralized prime minister you ever had in India. The man who gave rights to information, right to food, right to education. It's a reaction to that. But again, the cycle may be over, and we have to go back to something that was much more Indian in a way. How do you rule India without decentralizing power and recognizing rights? I think this is why the glass is more than half full.
Could I just come in a little bit, just for a moment, in response to Christophe? I mean, I find the idea of coming to the end of a cycle very appealing in one way, but I want to come back to something that you said earlier about the deep state. And I was very struck by the idea of the deep state in the sense of the state that is deeply rooted in society. And I think what concerns me about this present conjuncture is that all the evidence from the surveys and so on and what actually happened in the election are that, it is a minority perhaps of the whole of Indian society, but it is a very substantial minority.
And active. And
the ideology is, I think, the ideology of Hindutva is very deeply rooted in society. Yeah. And that makes me less convinced than I want to be, if you will, at the idea of a cycle having come to an end.
Except that the antidote in terms of narrative to Hindutva is caste. And it can be the solvent of this narrative. And just to go back to your point, Harsh, one sentence. Yes, Muslims will not be defended as Muslims, but Muslims will benefit from the shift from a narrative that is based on identity to a narrative that is based on social issues.
But can I, Christophe, again, as with Rahul's answer, I feel a sort of sense of regret and sadness. Dr. Baker had spoken about 2 kinds of majorities, as you would remember. One is a communal majority, where you vote because of what you're born. And the other is a political majority, where you vote because of what is being promised. In neither caste nor religion, it is entering into a political majority. Are we not? Is there no prospect that young Indian voters will say, forget about my religion, forget about my caste, I want jobs, I want a decent education system, I want a healthcare system that works. Isn't that a salvation path which will truly defend democracy? And are there no chances for that?
No, certainly, simply, where are the bulk of the voters, not among the young urban class people, urban middle class people. They're in the village. And this is where, when you look at the election results, this is where the opposition won. They lost the cities again.
Yeah, no, that is precisely where I believe that they did start moving towards a political force rather than a communal force, where they were saying, think of us as young people looking for jobs.
Yeah.
But think of us as farmers. Think of us as, and that is perhaps to me the most hopeful possibility. Not even the Mandal versus the Mandal, but yeah, citizenship.
I think, I agree with you, Harsh, that there is a possibility there. But I think that what we desperately need then is the opposition to actually be able to project a different vision of the economic future of the country, to project, I would say, actually a vision of social democracy, and to put that across as the alternative to the kind of crony capitalist version of neoliberalism that we've had, and it's developing that as
it's radical new imagination. In fact, I really strongly believe that what we need is radical new imaginations about how we will manage the economy so that you have decent work and I'm not hearing that. I'm hearing that they're distributing this, we distribute that, etc., etc. It's not a radical new imagination of how we manage our economy, how we manage our country. So yeah, I think that's where we need to go. But just looking at the watch and
may I just enter into this conversation, because when I said glass half empty and half full, and both my colleagues have disagreed with me slightly. But I have maintained a very safe position, and I'm not an astrologer. But I must confess that Christophe is the wine India watcher who says things in advance that people come to realize much later. So he has this deadly reputation that, he talked about the rise of the OBCs much before ordinary people like me understood that that's going to happen. So and without becoming an astrologer, I would take his advice seriously and give it a thought. But I just want to say,
I wish this India watcher would also, India living watcher, no, I wish we would move towards talking about a better life.
Yeah, but what I want to say is that something that we were discussing yesterday, that, the one difference between what we call populism and a lot of the things that we see in ethno-nationalism is that populist leaders often use clientelistic ways to win voters. So getting votes becomes a transaction. To the extent that it becomes programmatic. For example, in the implementation of the National Rural Guarantee Scheme in Andhra Pradesh, about which we have written, not perfectly non-clientelistic, but to a much greater extent programmatic. I think political scientists like us today will at least not call it populist. We will say that this is social democratic. This is welfare social democratic, right? Now, the problem with ethno-nationalist leadership is that unlike either the populists or the programmatic social democrats, they have now tried to bring their voter base through a different causal mechanism, which is by othering the minority and making the majority feel that vulnerable minority is threatening them. Now, that story, I think what Christophe is saying, has its limits. Now, it will not happen in a perfectly social democratic way, but on the other, the social democratic experience also lives with us. I mean, there was a rights-based approach. All of that happened within coalition politics and democracy. So we have a variety of seeds that have been planted. And in that plantation, I completely agree with you that not following the Indian secular model, not the French secular model, which is Sarvakarma Samabhava, and social democracy, can in the long run be politically debilitating. Because look at the politics literature of the past. It talks, I think James Maynard and others have written about this, that you can't not but accommodate diversity to win elections, right? Now, these guys have tried a different mode of operation. And what Christophe is saying is that that has reached to a certain extent its limits. And I think this is a believable proposition. How did the transition to more democratic propensities happen? Maybe not in a perfectly social democratic way. However, if you have a caste census and you start empowering people who are at any rate underprivileged in a way that any other decent society would give them something better, I don't see many problems with that. And the way societies perform actually doesn't often happen through the ideal normative framework that we like. So I would not, therefore, for these reasons, believe that what Christophe is trying to project is not believable.
So we reached a point in our discussion where all our three political astrologers give us reason to go. I, as somebody who's lived my life with life optimism, I'm not so persuaded. But let me go to the second question that I'm looking at my watch. I just read it out. And this is, let us look at what do you see as the future of fundamental constitutional freedoms. Do you expect that dissent will no longer be so fraught with danger? Will political prisoners detained for years without trial be released? With weaponizing of anti-terror, sedition and money laundering laws end or be restrained? What's basically the freedom of conscience? We talked about the freedom of religion. What's going to happen to the freedom of conscience in this non-ideological alliance, this tactical alliance that Mr. Modi is leading? So let's go this way.
Okay. What's going to happen to the freedom of conscience?
You just wrote a book called
Exactly.
Constitution for us. Yes.
I'm not hugely optimistic, to be honest, Harsh, about the future of the fundamental rights. Partly because I think there are, if you will, certain flaws in the constitutional settlement. I mean, I mentioned earlier the extent to which it was said in the Constituent Assembly debates that much depends on the character, the integrity of the leaders.
And Mr. Pandit, I think his biggest success in destroying the institutions, we may not be able to get that, is by the selection of the people who occupy these positions. I do nothing else.
Yeah. So I worry that there are, if you will, loopholes in the most critical legislation itself. I mean, the loophole that you and many of your colleagues, for example, wrote that letter about 3 or 4 years ago about the notification of the 44th Amendment with regard to Article 22, so that there should be proper judicial scrutiny of preventive detention. That part of the 44th Amendment has never been notified after now just about half a century. That's one particular instance of the if you will, the loopholes in the critical legislation, which make me, perhaps, let me put it this way, less optimistic than I'd like to be about in a way, the reassertion of the fundamental rights the reassertion of the values that are stated in the preamble to the Constitution.
Christophe, how full is the glass as far as...
Well, on that front, I share John's skepticism because of what we see on the Supreme Court side. If one institution has been surprisingly pliable
And disappointing.
it is the Supreme Court of India. When you remember what it was, when you remember the model it was for the world, the grand Supreme Court of India, how do we explain that? Again, we have to look at the sociology of the judiciary. It does not help to have upper caste males, rather conservative in their mindset.
Yeah.
Secondly, every man has a price. And if you have post-retirement jobs, you self-censor when you're still in office.
But the third is the more worrying one of the ideologically driven.
And this is related to the sociology, but it is related to the infiltration of the judiciary.
Yeah.
And that's something RSS is working on for decades.
Yeah.
And they are very good at figuring out who at the High Court will be reaching the Supreme Court and when. Yeah. And we may be reaching the moment when all the Chief Justice of India for many years will not be of the same kind anymore. So you have this press, last but not least, and this is something Prashant Bhushan said plainly. It's not too difficult to blackmail judges when they have potential cases against them. Yeah. This is something we can't rule out. Corruption of the judges make them very vulnerable vis-a-vis a government who has a file on everyone. Yeah. So for big reasons, which may not disappear tomorrow, how can they be true to their mission in this context? The only, ray of hope may come from, there may be one sensitive to public opinion, to the movement. The judiciary is never insulated from society. So there is something we saw even in Pakistan, we saw elsewhere. You take courage when you have the people pushing you in this direction. And two, the way the rest of the world and the rest of the judiciary in the world is watching them, maybe them also sensitive to, a kind of benzamite, but panopticon of another kind.
Yeah, right.
But we should always remember these 10 years, and this is judiciary should allow people to stay in, some of our best hearts and minds, to stay in prison for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years without the beginning of a trial. This is a disgrace that allowed the rebuilding and the building of a temple at the site where it was.
Oh, the list is so long and full.
So, Rahul, given your special research that you've been doing on the suppression of dissent in civil society, how much do you expect that to change?
Can I also reflect on this question and the kids? Yeah. So my view is somewhat different. I don't disagree with the fact that I am not optimistic about the institutions. But I have found, and I have done fairly serious research on the telecom regulator in India, which is completely compromised. And we are also looking at the Supreme Court, somewhat not as a great scholar of the law. But we find that when you have weak coalition governments, you actually get a strong and activist court. So what happened to the court under Mrs. Indira Gandhi? Very similar to what has happened today.
Yeah.
And then when did judicial activism come about? When there were coalition governments in power. So I think the people of India and the politics of India has to change. If the people of India, the politics of India, of course the people of India, I think is still there. Politics of India has to change. Then it will be relatively easy to bring back these institutions. However, if what I started by saying, that this majoritarian propensity, which as Christophe and de jure and de facto are undermining institutions, and if they are able to get away with it without letting, let's say, without letting the political opposition that has actually arrived to have a say, then the judiciary, the Central Bureau of Investigations, I mean, for example, the way in which Jio has become the largest telecom regulator is a big scandal. Mm-hmm. And I shared it with you, right, in Paris. So the point I'm making is that we have to go back to politics, and that politics has to look at civil society and political party as half-half. And I completely agree with you that you cannot be defensive on the questions of the ethnic minority. I mean, that cannot be the way in which you bring... See, politics has to come back, and then institutions will come back. But if you expect institutions to come back before politics comes back, then I don't see. And from that perspective, answering your question becomes very simple then. That has that politics come back? Now, if you look at it as glass half full, you know that you need more than 270 legislatures. The current party doesn't have. Now, what is the extent to which the current dispensation, using the same Home Minister and the same Prime Minister, will be able to intimidate the judiciary and the opposition, give them carrots and sticks to move ahead? Or will the caste census stand in the way? Or will the fact that Chandrababu Naidu has Muslim voters and he's not known to be a Muslim hater stand in the way?
State elections.
State elections in Maharashtra are important. Mr. Nitish Kumar has to live up to his reputation of the caste census. And if all of these things come together, then what we see is the arrogance of what you once called a wounded tiger will end. On the other, if the opposition, as I said, under conditions of enormous repression, loses its path and falls into the intimidation of a dispensation which is still pretending that it has a majority, fools the opposition and doesn't scare the opposition enough to come together and unite. And the reason why I am using these pragmatic arguments is not because I don't think that the normative argument is important. It is absolutely important. That's the answer. But when you are seeing that people are not coming around to the normative argument, the second best is certainly not the enemy of the best.
Yeah.
And from that perspective, I would not completely lose my hope because I still have opposition. I mean, if I follow Christophe's perspective, that the entire game has not been lost. However, it's only a ray of hope. And if the ruling dispensation is able to shut the door, and in relation to the research that we have done, we find that civil society in India is actually the major part of the political and social society which is being attacked. Unfortunately, the media is not looking at this because it is really not such a great thing to talk about. And this part of society is also more vulnerable because it doesn't stand for elections. When you look at so many members of the parliament, you are not looking at saving Dr. Harsh Mander. You are not looking at saving Tista Sekalwar. You are not looking at saving, Apat Patel. You are looking at seeing whether Mr. Kejriwal is in prison or not. And this is a big problem. Opposition parties have to realize, well, I'm not talking about the ruling party because I have no hope for the ruling party. Why should I waste my time? It is very clear. But opposition parties have to understand the importance of Sarvadharma Samabhava, that their social base has to emerge from there. And there is a lot of fertility in the Indian soil to work with that. And if they are able to come together, which is their only hope, then not only will they be able to save civil society, they'll be able to save themselves. But if they are unable to do that, and the current dispensation continues to do what it does, on the contrary, is even able to divide and despoil the current, then I think the situation is very bad. But what's really the resilience part of it, and our research actually shows that people like Harsh and others who have been defending minority rights most vigorously among the civil society organizations of India are also the most intensively hit. And this is clearly coming out in our research based on primary materials that friends have shared. So politics has to realize this. And politics also has to realize that these are the very voters who are poor and who are big minority, but an ethnic minority. And with a lot of others who are in the majority community who still haven't stopped voting for this idea, have to come together. And therefore I kind of end again with not the idea that one can be very optimistic, but the glass is half full and it is half empty. I would say that the story is not over, but it is
dictated by
but what is looking like a major challenge today of the wounded tiger, we have to see whether it heals or whether it leads to its ultimate demise.
Very, very thoughtful. We just have a few minutes, but I did want to take on from the last set of questions is what should happen if the institutions of democracy repair? What we speak, the freedom of conscience, the freedom of religion, all of these can be defended if the judiciary, parliament start with, the political opposition, the higher judiciary, the civil service, we forget, the media, the liberal arts university, and civil society. All of these, until they repair the other two sort of sets of democratic freedoms, there'll be no one to defend it. So will they at last discover their spine? Will they at last find their voice? And most importantly, will they find their conscience? So just a minute from both of you, and then we look forward. John.
I'm ever so sorry, Harsh. I'm not entirely sure of what your question is. I do apologize.
I'm noticing the prospect of the institutions that were designed to keep the executive in check and accountable.
Yep.
Are they going to find again their voice and conscience and spine?
I'm almost speechless because I do have some hope because there are a lot of people in those institutions
of character
who do actually hold the values that are enshrined, if you will, in the Constitution as central to their lives. There are plenty of others who don't hold those values, and to go back to some of your earlier comments, Harsh, who are, I think, fairly committed to the ideology of the present ruling dispensation. But I think there are always grounds for hope in the fact that there are still a lot of people out there in those institutions who are fighting all the time for the values of the democracy.
Yeah. What India can recapture is the sense of diversity. Mm-hmm. And I would emphasize that rather than values. Values being a kind of bonus. I know it's very strange to use these kind of words, but I think power stops power more than anything else. And federalism, reflecting diversity, will help to make the center more vulnerable, more bargain-oriented, more coalition-oriented. Secondly, we know what it is to be Indian the non-Bharat way, to be Hindustani, yes. To go to the DAAGH and meet people of a different religion.
Absolutely.
This is the civilization that is under attack today, and that can be recaptured. You cannot say this is rooted in values in the sense that it's more a culture than a value for me. Yeah?
It's a civilizational kind of legacy that people can...
That can be recaptured. So it will be something like diversity, cultural, linguistic, religious diversity, becoming again the alpha and omega of civil society. And if you stop the majoritarian, authoritarian kind of power, inevitably it will come. Because it is there. And if you remove the people who are under the thumb, that's what we saw after the emergency. You know, for 17 months, people were frozen in time and very docile. Mm-hmm. Now it's not 17 months, it's 10 years. So of course, the damage is bigger. But I would suggest that, yes, if we want the values to prevail again, it is through the diversity that is there that we can recapture that.
I think that's a great thought to end this conversation with. In the nature of my work, all my life, I've spent my finest time with the most underprivileged and dispossessed of Indians. And for them, this is a way of life. I mean, this is not something that, and often they use the metaphor that, imagine a garden with just one set of one color flowers, how boring it is. We are such a beautiful country because there are all kinds of flowers with all kinds of colors. And I think that idea of itself will prevail. It is that hope.
Yeah.
And very reluctantly I bring this conversation to a close, and I hope we can sit together maybe a year later or months later to see how well your astrology is. I hope that all the despair that one is being pulled into proves poorly founded. and that we find more and more reason to relate. And hope is, I think, a public duty. And let me end with a poem that keeps coming back to me by Rabindranath Tagore, where he's talking about the country he wants to build. He wants to see where the mind is without fear, where the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into narrow domestic walls. Into that heaven of freedom, let my country awake.
ये दाग दाग उजाला ये शब गजीदा सहर, वो इंतजार था जिसका, ये वो सहर तो नहीं।